I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. It is my great honor to welcome here today Professor Stephen Vogel, who is the Professor of Political Science, Political Economy, the Johann New Professor of Asian Studies, and Director of the Political Economy Program at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also my former advisor. So I arrived at Harvard as a nervous graduate student and was delighted when I was able to take classes and have Steve Vogel serve on my dissertation committee. He is an incredible scholar and advisor. And when I think about Steve's work, it is truly impressive on many dimensions of scholarship, both as one of the leading scholars studying Japan and one of the few who can really take a question that is deeply important to understanding Japan, but frame it in a way where people thinking about comparative politics more generally will want to take those lessons from Japan and have them shape how they consider Europe or the United States. He has successfully done this in much of his earlier work. His first book, Freer Markets, More Rules, Regulatory Reform in Advanced Industrial Economies, is really an incredible study that, as a new graduate student, I had that book next to me as I was trying to think about how to do research, because he really looks at this question about re-regulation and how sometimes as countries open up and change, they end up adding new layers of rules. And that certainly was the case for Japan's reform, but he puts Japan in the context of comparison. He also wrote a 2006 book, Japan Remodel, How Government and Industry Are Reforming Japanese Capitalism, which really is front and center about Japan's effort to reform its economy, but is offering lessons to many others that are dealing with these problems when you have miracles that encounter difficulties of economic hard times. His latest book, Marketcraft, How Governments Make Markets Work, came out from Oxford in 2018 and is looking broadly at this issue of reform and the many nuanced ways that market reforms are broad social reform that is not just one governance policy, but rather a whole system of reforms that take place. As an advisor, Steve was always generous with his time and gentle with his advice, which is important. And he takes this forward in the way that he engages with the discipline. So I'm really glad that he's here to present new work that is the next project so that he can share with us his ideas, we can offer our reactions. And as always, he is taking a question that is really important, looking at predistribution as a solution for inequality. And this is, as he has in much of his work, he takes a question that is broadly important and connects it to Japan and broader policy debates. We've all been thinking about inequality. Rising income, wealth inequality is front and center in the United States. It's increasingly a concern for Japan, which long took pride in being a middle-income society and now has to worry about the fact that its Gini coefficient is rising. Not yet to the level of the United States, but higher than it was in the past. We see movies like Shoplifters that put front and center this problem that there are people in Japan who are struggling just to get by. And as we think about what are the solutions, Steve is going to be talking about different approaches. And I encourage you all to offer advice and reactions. And we have 30 minutes to hear your presentation and then 30 minutes for question and answer. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Christina, for that extraordinarily gracious introduction. As Christina mentioned, I was here many years ago as a member of the faculty. It was at that time that I encountered a brilliant PhD student, Christina, and had the pleasure of working with her. It's also during that period that I encountered another brilliant PhD student from Princeton, Winston Fujihira, and also when I had the pleasure of working with the world's most fabulous senior colleague, Susan Farr. So it's just a true pleasure to have this opportunity to come back. I will say that it posed a bit of a conundrum for me because I'm actually not working on research on Japan right now. Not because I've passed Japan, but because I happen to be even more worried about our own country. I tell my Japanese friends, I think you're going to be okay. My own country, I'm not so sure. So that gave me a choice. I could either talk about research that was already done on Japan or research that was not yet really started. And I thought, well, it's going to be a lot more fun to do the latter. So let's go with that. So in that spirit, this is work almost not yet in progress. So I would certainly welcome your thoughts, and you can certainly help me think about how to move this forward. So basically what I want to do is take the idea of predistribution compared to redistribution. I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a moment, and apply it to Japan and make a fairly simple and straightforward argument, which we think looked at through the predistribution lens. Japan was a success story from the early post-war period. Its predistribution advantage eroded since 1990, but Japan could do it again. Now, Prime Minister Christina actually kind of addressed this issue because he came to office saying he was going to invent a new capitalism, right? And deliver growth with equity. And it's interesting because that idea that you could have growth with equity challenges a very basic assumption that many people, shared in the post-war era, not just in Japan, but everywhere, right? There was a tension or a trade-off between growth and equity. You could have one or the other, but the two were kind of in contradiction. And Kishida's aspiration challenges that assumption, right? She said, no, we can have both, right? And I would argue that Japan's record demonstrates that the relationship between growth and equity is not necessarily a negative one, both in the positive sense of its success in this earlier period and also in the negative sense of the latter period. In other words, the earlier period shows that you can have both growth with equity, and the more recent period shows you that inequality can actually be a drag on growth. Right? And again, that's not a lesson just for Japan. I think that's very much true of the United States today, and economists, I think, are putting out more and more research to show that more complex relationship between the two. And without delving into all of the details, because there are many different mechanisms, but one of the most important mechanisms in terms of the positive association is a macroeconomic one. The idea that if you have greater equity, for example, in the early post-war period, then you have a larger middle class, you have higher consumption, higher confidence, and that drives growth, right? And then the opposite is true in terms of the negative cycle, right? Where you have inequality, that becomes a drag on consumption, that becomes a drag on growth. And that's, I think, describes the dynamic certainly we've seen in the United States and Japan in recent decades. All right, so about time to say what predistribution means. This is one way to think about it. Should we, right, compensate people for the inequalities that result from markets? That's what we're trying to do when we redistribute. Or should we reform society and markets to generate less inequality in the first place? That would be predistribution. So to make the conversation more concrete, I'm going to separate this out into buckets of policies. And we've got 3 columns, but I'm really thinking of 4 buckets, right? Public investment and market governance, which are more on the predistribution side. And then taxation and welfare spending, which are more on the redistribution side. And at this point, I think it's very important that I insert a major caveat, which is that there is not a clear black line between the two. And in other words, in practice, the two tend to blur, right? The predistributive policies have some redistributive qualities, and redistributive policies may have some predistributive qualities. And yet, I would argue that the conceptual distinction is useful nonetheless, because, for example, if we're evaluating redistributive policies like the welfare policies on the lower right, I think it's useful to think to what extent do these also have predistributive qualities. And I would even argue that you might want to favor redistributive policies that do some predistribution rather than ones that are purely or more purely redistributive. Again, if that sounds too abstract, think about the difference between pensions that might be more on the pure redistribution side, versus universal preschool, right? Which would be both, right? Because on the one hand, you're transferring real resources in real time to families because they're not having to spend something that they otherwise would have. Right? So it's redistributive in that sense, but it's also predistributive in the sense that it's giving education to somebody who's going to be productive in the future, and you're giving a parent greater opportunity to either go to school or to get a job. So you're kind of getting both at the same time. So that's just a way, it's a conceptual lens to try to think about policies, not to argue, not to overstate the case and say that there's like this bright red line that just differentiates them. All right, economists have taken more interest in this recently. And the way they define it is basically looking at income before and after taxes and transfers, right? So, you know, it's not perfect given what I just said about the blurring between the two, but it is a useful way to kind of measure the relative impact. And what's particularly interesting, for example, in this study by Monsell and Gethin, they find that if you're trying to look at the difference between the United States and Europe, and inequality over the past couple of decades has been increasing in all advanced industrial countries, but much more rapidly in the US than in Europe, for example. So what explains that difference? I think normally or conventionally we thought, well, that's because, you know, they're socialists over there and they redistribute more. And so that's why they have more income inequality. And what these authors are saying, no, actually, that's exactly wrong, right? That the US redistributes just as much as Europe, right? And one way to think about this that makes it maybe more intuitive is that we have a more progressive tax system. But it's the predistribution side that actually explains most of that difference. So that's what they're finding, which is very convenient for me because I want to talk about predistribution. So in a separate paper, I am starting to think about kind of the normative case and try to present an argument that we should prioritize, not that we should not redistribute, and I'll come back to that, I'm definitely not arguing that, but I am arguing that we should prioritize predistribution. And so this slide, I'm just giving you like a little bit of a teaser and then we'll move back to Japan. But the argument I try to make there is that predistribution gets at the heart of inequality rather than compensating for it. That it's more just because it's trying to give workers fair wages and consumers fair value rather than kind of pay them off for injustices. It's more just because it's not taking away from one group and giving to another. It's more respectful of human dignity because it doesn't come in the form of sort of like a charity. It balances power, for example, between employers and employees or large incumbent firms and their challengers, and therefore enhances democracy. It's more market conforming, again, because it's not trying to redistribute change outcomes, market outcomes. And it's more feasible politically. Again, all of these are complex arguments, but just to kind of throw out the ideas, and we can come back later if you want. More feasible politically, again, because it's not taking away from one group and giving to another, and also because it depends on what policy we're talking about, but certain predistribution policies, like the market governance ones, don't actually cost that much in terms of budget. All right, so back to Japan. So, like I said, I want to divide it two periods. This is kind of my overview slide for the first period. And what I'm going to do is try to kind of briefly go through these different elements. And then I'll show you some graphs that will hopefully corroborate at least some of what I just said. So the Japanese post-war period was characterized by one of growth with equity. You had very high growth and relatively equitable distributions of income. Part of this, I mean, we just have to say at the outset, is because wealth was so thoroughly destroyed by the war. And then that was also compounded by land reform. So in a sense, Japan was kind of born equal in the post-war period. So that's part of, but that is, you know, land reform is kind of a predistribution, right? Because it's kind of starting people at a more equal point. Then you had public investment in education, which was relatively equitable, right? Public education for all. And big spending in terms of infrastructure, like transport infrastructure, for example. In terms of market governance, you had the dissolution of the zaibatsu, so that's also kind of a diffusion of health and economic power. And then as the post-war period evolved, you had kind of a post-war settlement where workers got more job stability in exchange for not striking so much. So there was kind of a labor management compact. And then there was also corporate governance that was oriented much less towards shareholders and toward a broader array of shareholders, in a sense, kind of sharing the wealth in that way. Then if you think about the dual political economy of Japan, right, which relied heavily on protection of farmers and retailers. Again, normally we think of this as kind of like a bad thing. It's kind of standard economics because it's inefficient. But the predistribution lens, I think, kind of sheds a more positive light on those policies because it tells you that this was one way of kind of balancing out incomes, right? It was, in a sense, predistribution in the sense that the farmers were making more than they would have, and retailers were earning more than they would have without that kind of protection. And that was one way of kind of a welfare system that wasn't built on redistribution, but on a kind of more equitable distribution of income in the first place. Again, it may be inefficient in the kind of a narrow economic sense, but maybe not so stupid in terms of kind of a longer term positive impacts, both economically and politically. And redistribution was relatively low, particularly in early post-war period, not surprisingly. And in addition to saying that Japan achieved growth with equity, I think it's very important to say that Japan also performed very well on certain social indicators. So it was successful, and there I'm thinking about obviously education, literacy, public safety, but also public health. So anyway, that's one way of kind of thinking of Japan as a predistribution success story. So as not to make this sound unreasonably rosy, we have to admit that there were, the system was not perfect, right? And there were some very deep-seated structural inequalities embedded in this whole model. Obviously, gender discrimination was one of them. Large geographical disparities between the cities and the outlying regions, and also within the economy between large and small. So I promised to have a little data. This is just showing growth. It doesn't unfortunately go back to the 50s. It starts in the 60s, but the 50s look like the 60s. In other words, very high growth through the 50s and 60s. The red line is Japan, and the blue is the OECD average. So very high growth that gradually slowed, and in more recent years has actually been under the OECD average. So that's, you're going from high growth to slow growth. This is some of the data from the Piketty group, the World Inequality Database. And this is the short version of Piketty's story, which is that you had high inequality up through about World War I. And then it decreased for a couple of reasons. One was the war itself, which obviously destroyed wealth. But another was much more progressive taxation. And so those two brought inequality down in most of the industrial world. And then it started going back up in the 1970s as tax rates on the highest income earners were then brought down again. And you had obviously neoliberal reforms, et cetera, et cetera. So the story is one of high, low, and then back up high, but with a dramatic difference between the US, that's the top line, and Europe, the bottom line. So it's increasing everywhere, but increasing more slowly in Europe. And Japan is very much the European pattern, right? Which is increasing, but not as much as the United States. So here we're bringing Japan into the story. And Japan is the triangles without anything in the middle of them. Interestingly shows that inequality was very high in the beginning of the century, then kind of low and pretty stable in the early post-war years, and then kind of slowly creeping up over the last couple of decades. In terms of the redistribution, Japan, the taxing and spending was relatively low among advanced industrial countries. Japan is the green, US is the blue. And then it goes 1965, it's going backwards, actually 85, 75, 65. But what this shows you is that Japan's tax rates in terms of total GDP were among the lowest of all of these countries throughout that period. And then in terms of the spending side, Japan is the blue here and the OECD average is the orange. And it shows you that Japan was below average for quite a while, but then it has crept up since then, partly due to demographic changes. And I won't go through all the different social indicators, but this is just one that you could pick and say, and here Japan is the red and US is the blue, showing that Japanese life expectancy, overall health, one indicator of health, overtook the United States actually in the 1960s and has continued to rise. All right, so what about the story after 1990? So now I'm going to, again, give you one overview slide talking about the general trends since 1990, and then I'll show you a few data slides and we'll wrap up. So growth slows, inequality rises, right? So the kind of the virtuous cycle turns into a more vicious one. There's lots of ways to think about how Japan went from high growth to low growth. But one that I think is important is that part of Japan's post-war success was because Japan successfully kind of rigged the financial system to increase savings and investment. Was exactly the right thing to do after a war because your potential growth rate is very high. And if you want an economy to grow, basically, at its simplest, you have to do two things. One is increase the level of investment, and two is put that investment to relatively good use. So they did that. But you do that for decades, and eventually overinvestment creates overcapacity. So that's one way to think about what happened in the 1990s. And obviously that produced a financial crisis. Meanwhile, the dual political economy, I was trying to put a kind of a rosy face on that a minute ago, but and it's always, right? It's always a combination of rational investments in needed infrastructure and politically motivated, but the balance shifted over time, right? From partly because it was just infrastructure was a crisis level need after the war, but at a certain point, you built the bridges you need, and eventually you're starting to build bridges to nowhere, right? Because of some politician. So there was kind of a devolution in terms of the developmental impact of those investments. The educational advantage diminished. So, in terms of Japan's ranking vis-a-vis, for instance, its Asia neighbors, but maybe even more importantly, you had greater educational inequality, right? So that you had the system started the inequalities both in terms of spending, but also the education system became less of a kind of a beacon of equal opportunity and more of one that was kind of reinforcing inequality for some of the same reasons you see in the United States, for example, which is that wealthier parents can afford the best jukus, can get their student, even though they, in a literal sense, the system is meritocratic because there's one exam for everybody, but some people, have greater advantages in preparing for that exam. And so those kind of, the advantages of more well-to-do students, I think, increased over time. And so it wasn't quite as equitable. In terms of market governance reforms, I'll just mention the two that I worked on, corporate governance and labor market. In terms of corporate governance, there was an attempt to move towards a shareholder model. I don't think they ever got there, which is a good thing. But still, you have a system that was oriented more towards maybe increasing returns for corporations at the expense of wages for workers. And that got you that negative dynamic, right, where workers didn't have enough money to spend. And so you had macroeconomic harm done by that approach, which, maybe it made sense for companies in the 1990s, but eventually it kind of has a negative impact on growth because via consumption. And then in terms of labor market, you had a kind of what was called deregulation, but was basically giving firms greater flexibility in terms of hours, in terms of different tiers of workers, in terms of hiring dispatch workers. And that contributed to kind of greater precarity in the labor market. And kind of as I've already shown you, you had some increase in tax and welfare spending over time. Here's just some more figures to kind of look at that. This is another way of looking at inequality. The blue line is the share of national income going to the bottom 50%, and the red line is the share going to the top 1%. So as those two lines converge, what that's suggesting is that inequality is increasing, although interestingly, pretty much flat since about 2010 by this figure. But I think what is striking is if you compare that same figure to the US, and this is what happens in the United States, right? So much more dramatic decrease in the share of the 50% and much more dramatic increase in the share that goes to the 1%. Average wages in Japan are stagnate. That's the red line. The blue line is the OECD average. And so this is part of that puzzle of why the Japanese economy is slow, is that people aren't making more money, so they're not spending more money. This is the increase in precarity, just one measure of it, which is the non-regular share of the workforce, which is it's grown over this period and is now extremely high, bumping up closer to 40%. This just shows the progressivity of taxes, and it shows Japan is in the kind of in the middle there. The US is the red on the right. And it highlights the point I was making a moment ago, which is that the US is actually have a relatively progressive tax system, and Japan not so much. So you're not getting a high level of redistribution through the tax system. And so what should you do? So in conclusion, I want to kind of just give you my general conclusions for like the world, I guess, and then try to apply them to Japan. So I mentioned that I kind of make this case for the predistribution advantage. If that's true, I think there's actually some fairly concrete policy implications of that worldview, which would be that first you should eliminate policies of upward redistribution. Japan is not the most egregious example of this. I think that would be the United States, but second, you would want to prioritize public investment and try to achieve not formal equality of opportunity, but substantive, right? So that means that you would invest in, for example, education, either equally or actually no, disproportionately in the least advantaged areas, right? I don't have the exact data, but basically, many countries, education spending is progressive, like in Europe, and on balance, you're spending more in the least advantaged areas. In the US, it's actually regressive, right? The wealthier the district, the more we spend. And in Japan, it's relatively equal. Reform market governance to balance market and political power. I have a slide to try to explain what I mean by that. This is a different paper that I've worked on which I call market governance as a balance of power. One way to think about all the arcane regulations is to think that they're not neutral, right? Any market governance system that you come up with is going to either advantage or disadvantage certain groups in society. And so one simple way to think about it is to kind of think about the more powerful actors. So let's take the example of labor relations, employers versus employees. You can make the rules go one way or the other. I think the broad trend under neoliberalism in many countries is that market governance has shifted to the left, right? In other words, more pro-employer, more pro-incumbent. And things like antitrust policy and labor reform are trying to address that, trying to create more countervailing power. And so I'm suggesting that if you care about inequality, that's exactly what you would want to do, right? In other words, is to move regulations from pro-employer to pro-employee. One very concrete way of saying this, and maybe, well, I was going to say this applying to Japan, but I might as well go ahead and say it now, is to try to think about labor flexibility, not from the employer side, but from the employee side, right? Okay, and then kind of what I was saying earlier is that this conceptual distinction can help you evaluate, like, let's say, redistributive policies to think to what extent that they have redistributive effects, and you would want to favor ones where you kind of get both. All right, so then applying that to Japan, that would mean you'd want to increase public investment. to the Kishida administration's credit, they are working on some of these things. And I think precisely because they were trying to achieve growth with equity. I didn't say it earlier, but the attempt to achieve both kind of broke down a little bit. Because when they started talking about concrete policies, they kind of broke down into the growth camp and the equity camp. But at least the way it was described to me is that, the administration, Kishida came in with the equity camp kind of at the top. And then they got stuck on capital gains tax, which is a policy that would be favoring equity potentially expensive growth. And the pro-growth camp was like, no, you can't do that, right? That might be bad for the stock market. That might be bad for growth. And so my point being that he came in with this concept that we can achieve both. And yet in practice, the tensions came out between those. And I would argue that because of that, they failed to fully embrace policies that would achieve both at the same time. Having said that, I'm giving them some credit because some of their investment in human resources, which is an investment in innovation, are policies where it could be win-win. So some credit for that, but I think they need to go much further, and particularly and not just in terms of developing technology, but also the usage of technology where Japan is behind. Market governance, I kind of mentioned this already, but if you're thinking about it in terms of predistribution, you would be saying, don't try to emulate the United States with hire and fire labor markets and shareholder model. You should actually be wanting to design these reforms for a more equitable distribution of returns, right? So for a kind of like a renewed stakeholder model of corporate governance and labor market reforms that I was suggesting a minute ago that are not so much trying to give flexibility to the employers, but to the workers. Finally, I wanted to just say, I don't mean to say that we shouldn't redistribute. In fact, I would argue that Japan needs more redistribution as well as predistribution. My own mentor at Berkeley, Hal Walensky, studied 20 rich countries over 60 years. And his bottom line was that you can have growth with equity, that they can be both a trade-off and they can be complementary. It depends on the quality of the policies. And so you want to target policies that achieve both. And the quintessential policy for him that achieved both was not the public investment and market governance that I'm talking about. It was family policies, like the preschool example I gave before. And for him, the world is a hierarchy with Scandinavia at the top, the rich countries, and the US at the bottom, right? And basically his bottom line was in terms of economic performance, all of these countries about the same. In terms of the social performance, it's the Scandinavians are at the top, the US and the Anglo-Saxon countries are at the bottom. And this is one of the big reasons. It's the countries that with the highest taxing, the highest spending, and the best investment in policies that achieve both growth and equity at the same time. So I think that's a lesson for Japan, which is obviously concerned about budget deficits. But I think it would actually be remiss to be too stingy because a robust welfare system is going to create more confidence, more equity, and actually be good for growth over the long term.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. We are going to open up. I'm sure there are questions. I will start off with Sayaka Kume, who is with us from the Ministry of Finance as an associate with the program on US-Japan relations. Here at Harvard, she's doing research on US-Japan and US-China trade disputes.
For your presentation, I focus on the distribution space. I understand that government has to design to increase the equality. But the problem is how to change the norms. It's sorry, it's a very broad question. It's been several years since laws related to the work style reform. Yes, some changes such as limited work, but I cannot feel that fundamental change. It's still company centered and gender biased. So I don't know how we can change the big number.
So obviously that's that's hard. I mean, that's the puzzle. In terms of labor market reforms, I think that Japan was since the 90s up until the work style reform and womenomics, Japan was moving in a largely deregulatory direction. What I mean by that is trying to increase more flexibility for the firms, not for the workers. And I think with womenomics and work style reform, I'll give the Japanese government credit. They started going the other direction, right? And it was fun to research this because I would be talking to unions or opposition leaders, and they were like, "Wait, this conservative government, they just came up with this idea. Maybe we should have equal pay for equal work, right?" And they're like, "I think somebody's been saying that for 20 or 30 years, but nobody's been listening, right?" And now we've got like the LDP is embracing this. Like what just happened? Our world is upside down. But I guess what I'm saying is I'll give them credit, even if it was very little, in moving in the right direction as opposed to moving in the wrong direction. So to get back to your question, then I think kind of my obvious response would be, got to go further, right? And get tougher, right? So for example, if we take that example of equal pay for equal work, I think the original approach was a very soft one, which is let's take the most blatant things and tell people they can't do that. For example, if you have a subway pass, whatever, allotment, and you have it for a non-regular worker and for a regular worker, it's really hard to justify why the one for the regular worker should be higher, right? That just doesn't make any sense. So they're like, stop that. But that's the point, right? You're just kind of getting at the periphery, at the most egregious, like, and then, but other things, a company can justify, or at least can attempt to justify by saying, well, actually, these are different types of workers, right? They happen to graft onto gender roles, but that's not the original point, is that certain workers have to take assignments, they have to do overtime work. And so if you don't want that, but that obviously becomes a wedge to discrimination because the difference in compensation and stability and benefits greatly outweighs, right, whatever that is. So my point is they have to kind of like move from the government has to move from the periphery to the heart of the problem. And that means cracking down enforcement, redesigning the rules to be more compelling. And that's precisely because I'm kind of accepting the logic of your argument, which is, right, you can't just say like, okay, everybody, you got to go home at 5 and expect companies are going to do that, right? So it's going to have to be tougher medicine to really change the practices, I think.
Okay, yes, please. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Takeshi, the visiting scholar of US-Japan program, and I'm studying politics of social investment state. And I want to ask about who do you think drive pre-distribution policy in current Japan? I totally agree with your policy prescriptions, but sustaining those policies require political force. And as you mentioned, until 1990s, the Japan balanced the growth and the equality, but that's because once Professor Kawashima the Tokyo University and the current governor of Kumamoto Prefecture argued that the LDP's clientelist politics stabilized Japan by redistributing wealth from cities to rural areas, because that's their winning strategy under the electoral systems. That the political force sustained that the equality and redistribution policies until 1990. But the contents of redistribution policy changed, like a gender equality and other things. So we need different political force probably. So who do you think who can drive those redistribution policies in current Japan under post-industrialization?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is that, Japan's political system is still working, so that it's easier to do this in Japan than certain other countries. But I would actually break down these different policies and say that the politics of each is different. If we start with the top, I mean, that's basically what Kishida has done. In other words, in order to growth with equity, like I said, where the two kind of conflict with each other, they haven't been able to move forward. They've only been able to move forward on the part of the agenda where they seem to be addressing both at the same time. And that specifically meant investment in human resources, right? And innovation. So those have been like the two pillars because that's what they could agree on. And so basically I'm saying they're moving in the right direction, just not enough. And so that would just take, I think, bolder leadership. I don't think it's impossible. Then on the market governance, I think that politics shifted. That's what I was kind of trying to say a minute ago when I said from the labor reform shifted from a more deregulatory to a more pro-worker. And again, not as much as we would hope, but it's still interesting to me that the direction changed. And the reason for that was because you had a labor shortage, right? As you moved from the labor surplus to a labor shortage, the politics shifted, right? And companies went from saying, please government, help me lower labor costs, to saying, please government, help me keep workers and get workers, right? And so that's a completely different set of policies. So that's promising. Obviously, COVID was a little bit of a curveball in that story of moving towards a labor shortage, but that's still probably the long-term trajectory. And so I would anticipate that it's going to be slow, but that labor policies are going to continue to move in a direction that's better for workers. In terms of corporate governance, I think the shareholder value, whatever boom, is sufficiently strong that it's hard to reverse it, but there's a lot can be done to slow it. Not everybody has bought into that. And then the last one I think is the toughest, because I think there's a large segment of whatever Japanese elites, maybe even the public, that thinks we can't afford to spend more because we have this huge budget deficit. And so there, I think in terms of politics, the only way I see that happening in a big way would be if we had a more dynamic competition between the LDP and the opposition, right? There you could imagine an opposition that would be pushing for, but we don't have that right now, right? Because, there's nothing like that in the short-term future, because I think that the Japanese voters maybe rationally have decided that they don't like the LDP, but at least they know how to run a country. And when the opposition was in power, things did not go so well. So that's unfortunately where Japanese politics is right now. But again, I would say if we're looking comparatively, it could be worse. Right?
Related to the labor shortage, Dan Smith is asking online, how is the balance between predistribution versus redistribution affected by Japan's aging society or the political bias to elderly voters rather than young people?
Well, if the elderly voters were really all powerful, then you might have more pressure for redistribution, right? So I don't think that the political support for redistribution is so strong that it would overwhelm the redistribution. So, and I think parts of this are maybe because of Japan's post-war success. I think parts of this argument are not that will be relatively intuitive to a Japanese person, right? The idea that like public investment is a public good, for example. So I guess I'm not sure that the demographic shift makes redistribution impossible, particularly relative to redistribution. Like I guess what I was trying to suggest as I went through these is that they're all politically challenging, but that the redistribution side might be more possible
I wonder, last week Rick Katz talked about the need for productivity growth in Japan to jumpstart the economy. And of course, that's even more true because of the demographics, that each young person has to produce more to support this age pyramid of older population. So the rationale for predistribution, universal education, more investment in youth could be part of how do you support this growing older population. So is there a narrative where you can try and build the political support for predistribution among the large voting group of elderly and make it incentive compatible?
Well, so public investment in education is not going to pay off for the elderly as much as it's going to for the younger. I mean, that's just the time lag. Although some of the training and diffusion of technology investment, those could pay off in the medium term, not necessarily just the long term. So I'm not sure that it would appeal to the elderly vis-a-vis everybody else, but I do think that yes, you can make a strong pitch that if Japan has a productivity problem, then it needs to invest in its people. Right? And it needs to invest in technology, and it needs to invest in the diffusion of technology, because I was suggesting before, that's where Japan is maybe furthest behind is the use side, is corporations, schools, government adopting digital technology. So I definitely think there's a political case that could be made, but I don't think I'm having trouble seeing how it could be pitched, to that segment. And it's more like a broader public welfare argument. Well, I just want to add one point on the productivity, which is it's true that U.S. GDP growth has been much stronger and productivity growth has been much stronger than Japan in recent years. But one of the dramatic graphs that looking at the United States is if you look at productivity increases from World War II to the present, it's like a straight upward line. And then if you look at wages, they follow that line perfectly until about 1980, and then it just stops. The point I'm making is that we're making more money than ever, but it's not helping the bottom 50%. And so if we if we kind of wonder why are people angry in the United States, that's one pretty good hint. So my message to the Japanese is it looks like the US is doing so much better, but it's not doing so much better for everybody.
We have many more questions, I'm sure. So I want to take 2 questions and ask everyone to have a short question. First, and who's next?
I'm Hiroshi Ota, and a visiting scholar to Harvard University. My major is education. And my question is upskilling, reskilling, new skilling is kind of becoming buzzword in Japan. And there's a kind of gap between higher education side and the company side. Higher education side, as you may know, more than half of the private university in Japan do not have enough students. They need a kind of new business. So upskilling, reskilling, new skilling, they think is a new kind of business to attract the new student. They're already in a workforce. Company size idea is upskilling, reskilling, new skilling is within the company. They shuffle the workers. So the both sides expect the money coming from government, not only the central government, national government, local government, students, also institutions. But the labor market or employment hiring practice is shifting from membership-based employment to job-based employment is so slow. So that is I'm working for the university. I'm kind of confused which way or which kind of chicken and egg kind of argument I'm asking you. But I would like to know your opinion which way we have to do what policy measures.
Hold your thought. Another question, but keep it short, please.
Could you elaborate a little bit about corporate governance? Apart from the policies to shift to favor labor versus shareholder value, just give some examples of what kind of corporate governance reform can take place in order to achieve better redistributional effect. Just examples.
And we do also have an online question about the gap between executive and worker pay. And the second set of online questions, then Shopa asking about minimum wage policy and whether that is part of the predistribution policy. So you have several questions you can
Okay,
answer
so
together or in
can you tell
turn.
me what the executive versus worker pay question is?
Will you predict significant wage gaps between executives and laborers as we see in the United States?
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I'll start with the last because they're maybe concrete. So in terms of executive versus worker pay, I would expect the gap to decrease slightly, but it's not going to be like US levels, and thank goodness for that. I was at a talk with a bunch of American investment bankers where they were saying, you know, why are Japanese CEOs underpaid? And I would kind of ask the question the other way personally, but anyway, so I think there'll be some modest, but not a convergent on the US system. To Len Shopa, yes, absolutely, minimum wage. I mean, minimum wage is both redistributive and redistributive. But yes, I think that's a policy that very much follows in the spirit. I would say though, I would favor labor market reforms that would favor worker power and worker flexibility, even higher priority, right, than the minimum wage. In terms of the education reform, that's a tough one. I would say that, but if you're thinking about reforms, you have to think about how they graft onto the Japanese context, right? It's not like what worked in the US is going to work in Japan. So I think what that would mean would be that the public investment would go into training at the high school level, at the college level, et cetera. That would be piece number one. But the reskilling, you know, I think that the companies might have a point there, right? I mean, in other words, that's where it's traditionally been done. And so I think that it would have to work with the existing, you know, whatever ecosystem to suddenly create, you know, ATT tech, you know, institutes all over Japan. I don't think is the right answer. And so it would to graft like policy reforms that work with what already works in Japan would probably be favorable. And then in corporate governance, I mean, I think that the Japanese, I'm a fan of the stakeholder model. I'm not saying it was perfect. So some of the reforms that Japanese corporate governance needs most are kind of orthogonal to everything we're talking about, which is that they do need like better accounting, transparency, you know, to improve accounting systems, and obviously greater diversity, right? That's another big thing that would change. It's not quite to your point, you know, what would be reforms that would be moving in the direction of stakeholder would be to have, so they're increasing outsider directors, right? But if you had those outsider directors representing either public interest or labor, right? That would be, I mean, that would be moving towards a more German model. But that would be a way that you could have a corporate governance reform that would reinforce stakeholderism rather than undermine it.
One more online, and why don't you go first, Mary?
Well, I've noticed a lot of the questions have been about labor market reform. I think probably it is because there's a big gap between what the government may want in terms of hatarakikata kaikaku and what firms want. Although some firms are being very innovative, you know, large firms in their human resource management practices. But anyway, we can talk more about it later, but you keep saying worker flexibility. What do you mean by worker flexibility? Do you mean the ability to move between Hiseki status and Seishain? And how do workers get more power? I really want to know how employees can get more power, especially, I'm not quite sure what Kume-san meant by norms, but things like Nenko Joretsu Seido, it's still there. You know, there's still a dramatic age hierarchy in management worker, you know, arrangements in large firms, and how do you, it's very sticky, you know, to overturn those types of norms. I'm sorry, it's a big question, but I think, you know, there are a lot of reasons why the labor market reforms proposed by the government are very hard to, they can't really make it happen unless the firms are on board, right? And unless somehow younger workers get more voice. So these are kind of structural and normative issues, I think. Maybe it's more a topic than a question.
No, there's great questions, and I'm not sure I could do them justice. In terms of flexibility, yes. One of the things I would be thinking about is what you said is like different gradations of that. It's a very stark choice right now.
Yeah,
between
yeah.
You're either gonna be a pure
Right, contract
trainee
worker,
or you're gonna be a non-regular.
right,
And to ameliorate that gap, you need like
right,
multiple options in between. Obviously, that, like anything else, the implementation is tricky because you want to
Very
make sure that you're not degrading lifetime employment. You want to be
Right.
upgrading.
and that's
Right.
one of the issues,
Sure.
right? The
Yeah.
people who are invested in, the 50-year-olds and so forth, who are invested in the old system. And they're running the show, right, basically. To some extent.
Right. I mean, a lot of these things, it's the proverbial glass half full versus glass empty. I mean, I'm kind of encouraged by this progress that's been made because at least it's in the right
Yeah.
direction.
Oh, absolutely. yeah.
And that's both in terms of public reforms and also at the company level. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, long way to go.
Yeah,
The other kind of flexibility I was thinking about was working hours and telework, right? You know, which I think would benefit Japanese individuals and families, and corporations have been very slow moving that
Mhm.
direction. And in terms of power, I don't have a good answer to you. I kind of feel like the unions could do more, right? I mean, or others, the environment has changed. In an earlier era, right, there was such a great surplus that it was very hard for unions to take. But I think when, you know, if the door, when I talk to the unions, what I say is, if they're gonna open the door a crack, you gotta like push it open.
right.
And so I think that they could, you know, and Japanese unions, whatever, have been moderate, you know, with the exception of certain fringe ones, like the mainstream, you know, so maybe they need to be a little more aggressive when, you know, conditions favor that.
Right, thank you.
The last question online, which actually was the first question, I just overlooked it. Asked about real estate and high property prices. And if you connected that to thinking also about inheritance tax. And I have to slip in my question about the rural economy, because I noted you said that the protection of farmers was part of softening the socially difficult adjustment in rural Japan. But it also had implications for food prices that are difficult for the poor in the cities. And of course, you've locked in land, so you don't necessarily get efficient land markets. So this is a sort of a broad set of questions. If you want to think about our high land prices, inheritance tax, or policies to the rural economy, a major part of redistribution, or would you think these are orthogonal?
So inheritance tax is kind of predistributive in a way, right? I think property taxes are more, well, I guess essentially redistributive, but there's also a predistributive element following what I was saying earlier. I do think that in terms of gross wealth inequalities, like a wealth tax is probably even though I'm obviously a big fan of predistribution, if you want to reduce wealth inequality fast, you know, a wealth tax is the fastest way to go. But I don't, you know, that's not as big a problem in Japan as it is in the United States, for example. In terms of agricultural protection, I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't efficiency costs. I'm just saying that particularly in the post-war system, it wasn't that crazy a thing to do. and that it did have a predistributive effect, right? In other words, instead of like having people in farm areas basically have no income and then giving them subsidies, give them a small plot, give a price subsidy, right? And so then you have the fulfillment of work and you have a kind of a middle-class lifestyle. And I do think that had, and so like I recognize that at a certain point, the inefficiency, right, can kind of take over and go too far. But I do think that there are also political benefits. I kind of wonder why we don't have rampant populism in Japan, and I have to wonder if that's because a lot of people can make a living. The would be, right, the people who would be angry aren't angry because the system gives them a way to make a decent living. And so those policies that seem kind of like crudely politically motivated, I think have had some positive effects.
Thank you so very much. You've taken a whole range of questions. This is an exciting
Thank you. Great
project,
question.
and I can't wait to see you continue to develop.